Network. My name is Omar Ashaka, your guest host. The title of our program today is Quiet Determination, Community Building of African Descendant Families, Yorktown, Virginia, after emancipation from 1865 to 1900. Our very special guest, welcome this week. Just say to be a lover of your own history, like you were born in Virginia, right?
I was born and raised in Virginia, and I do want to say that even though I was born and raised in Virginia, I had a very sheltered life in Virginia, in Williamsburg. My father was very protective of that. I must say that I left Virginia after graduating high school. I never really went back there to live.
Well, that's a compliment.
Bruton High School. Bruton High School was built in 1941 by the Rockefeller family, and it was a beautiful school, very close-knit school. So everybody went to that school from first grade through 12th. So everybody knew everybody. So it was a small school. So we weren't very competitive in terms of sports. However, we had a band, we had a football team, basketball team. So I'm sure whenever we played guys from the other part of the peninsula, like Newport News, Hampton, or Norfolk, we were always beat pretty badly.
Right. Is Bruton Heights still there as a school?
The physical plant exists. However, the school, I was in the last graduating class, the class of 1966. So at that time, politically, the counties were being forced by the NAACP to integrate. So, so the school was closed to, I guess they called it freedom of choice, where you had the choice to go to a different school. But my class was the last class. So after that, they just closed the school, and you had to go to the local white high school, which was James Blair High School.
Yeah, I remember James Blair too.
Yes.
Well, Miss Lee, you come from a very interesting family too, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Matter of fact, your title, and it starts out with Quiet Determination. Can you share with us, where did that come from?
Yes. Now, I only decided on this title about a year ago, and I got the title after working on family research or family history about 20 years, 20 plus years actually. But growing up in Williamsburg, we would always ask our parents questions about our early history, like where did we come from, were we slaves, or what have you. And we didn't get much information. I mean, we were always told, they never really addressed that period. They just never talked about it. They were very forward-looking people. They, always pushed us to do well in school, very family-oriented. I always say, like, where we lived was a village, because everybody who lived around us in the back of us were related in some way. You know, if they were not blood kin, they were fictive kin. In fact, we called them cousin this, aunt that, even though, so we were all family. So we had a very protected shelter growing up.
Now, it's interesting, these questions that was being raised about your family history. Were these young people raising these questions, or?
Yes, around the dinner table are talking, and if they had feelings about it or talked about it, it certainly was not talked in front of the children or with the children. And, you know, so whatever happened, they didn't share it with us. And so we had no knowledge of our family. We just knew we were family. We went to church, we went to school. You were always around family. So those questions at that time, in the middle 50s, late 50s, really was not important. And it wasn't until, I would say, after the movie Roots, or the television program Roots, that we began to get interested in our family history. And I think in the year 1976, there was an area that, well, Williamsburg was celebrating the bicentennial, and they began to interview older black people. And during that bicentennial period, some of the stories started coming out from some of the older relatives and kind of opened up to, what was going on.
Now, I know one of your relatives, I believe, was a Mr. Alexander Lee.
Yes,
And of course, the local newspaper, I think in Newport News, Daily Press,
the Daily Press.
did an interview with your uncle. Before we talk about Mr. Alexander Lee, were there any other relatives who were kind of vocal and shared?
None of them.
Okay. Well, tell our audience a little bit about Mr. Alexander Lee.
All right. Yes. Well, Mr. Alexander Lee is the grandson of James Monroe Lee. James Monroe Lee was a slave who was born in Virginia, in Yorktown, on what was called the reservation. And so James Monroe Lee had 5 sons. And Alexander Lee, who's the youngest brother of my father, is the son of John H. Lee.
Okay. So James Monroe Lee was the grandfather.
Was a great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather, okay.
The grandfather was John H. Lee, and Alexander Lee is the youngest son of John H. Lee.
Okay.
So actually, he's the great-grandson of James Monroe Lee.
Okay.
And he really did not remember his grandfather. I think when the grandfather died, he was maybe about 10 or 12.
How did this interview come up with the Daily Press?
Well, I'm not sure how the interview, I guess they were just doing feature stories, because I have here this one article where it says Firsthand Reflections. And this interview was with Miss Jennifer Anders, and I guess they were just interviewing him about early life on the reservation in York County. And in the article, he reflected on, and I guess this was stories that he had heard, although in the article he says that he remembers when they were told that they had to leave, and getting in his mother's lap, who was my grandmother, her name was Martha Lee. He remembers getting in her lap and crying because they had to move.
Let's talk about where the family had to move from.
Okay.
And why they had to move.
Okay. The reservation is actually located in Yorktown. And a lot of people only know about Yorktown as the place where George Washington defeated General Lafayette and brought the American Revolution to a close. So that's what most people associate with Yorktown. But there was a whole life in Yorktown. And I want to just veer back for like the founding of the Yorktown, because everybody knows that the Williamsburg area was one of the first permanent English settlements in the world, in the United States. So at some point, the tobacco wasn't turning over as much money as the investors from Europe wanted. So they created Yorktown. They created what they call ports. It's a port city because Yorktown is located right on the York River. And the York River flows right into the Chesapeake. So it's good to be near the water. So with the founding of Yorktown, which was founded after Williamsburg, they created about 20 little towns from that. And such towns as Gloucester, New Kent County, those counties came out from Yorktown. And basically it was to be a port where they could collect taxes because they were after money. So to get to the taxes and to get the money, because they didn't want the people trading with each other and with the Indians. They wanted trade to be at a port where they could tax the residents. So people were brought in, and of course, slaves were brought in to help them collect this money. Not to collect, but to do the work, to provide the money. So I guess my family, the Lees, were enslaved by a gentleman by the name of Thomas Tinsley, who owned 2 farms in Yorktown. Well, when the Civil War came, the Union soldiers, after taking over Hampton, they were trying to get to Richmond because Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy. So on the way to Richmond, they had a 2-day battle in Williamsburg, and they took, possession of Yorktown. So when they took possession of Yorktown, there were a lot of enslaved people who followed the Union soldiers. And so the Union soldiers put them to work because they had all these people, who attaching themselves because they knew that freedom was coming, and, they were just following the Union soldiers. So the Union soldiers gave them property, gave them land, had them working for their keep.
And your family was some of those individuals that actually...
Exactly.
So...
So, like from a historical standpoint, in 1862, because that's when the Battle of Williamsburg was, it was only a 2-day battle. They were on their way they had to go to Petersburg and fight there before they got to Richmond. But for the 2 days that they were in Williamsburg, they gave land to the blacks who were there. And of course, shortly after that, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. So actually, these people living on a reservation were free, after in 1863, before the war had ended. So that's how many of them got land right there on the reservation.
Let's do this for the audience, those viewers that might be watching. I know when I first heard reservation, that really kind of took me back. We usually associate the term reservation with Indians. Can you talk a little bit about that? I think I may have even asked you also, were there any Indians on this reservation with blacks?
Well, just from a historical standpoint, there were Indians all over in America initially before the Europeans came. So, of course, once they start settling, there were Indians on that area of the reservation, in that part of the land. In fact, there were several tribes, but one tribe that stood out was the Kissiak Indians. They did live there too. I don't know how many were there, but there is an area that was called Indian land. Now, how the term reservation came up, because whenever we would ask our father, where did we come from, and they always say, oh, we came from the reservation. We don't know how that term came up, but as I have begun to do research, well, during the war, when the Union soldiers would come and the original owners would leave, they would confiscate that land and call it abandoned land. So to keep a record of it, there were lands called Reservation 1, Reservation 2, but it was basically abandoned land. Because even in Washington, D.C., the site where D.C. General Hospital is located is referred to in records as Reservation 10.
Oh, really? Okay.
So abandoned lands were by the Union soldiers. If they were victorious in that area, they would confiscate the land and call it reservation.
Okay.
So all the black families, that's what they say, we came from the reservation.
Okay. Now, when we get to 1918, and if there's something else you want to mention before we get to this point, but that's when President Woodrow Wilson, there was an eminent domain.
Right, okay, I'll share that. So, as I say, many of those families received land in 1862 from the Union soldiers and lived there and actually had developed thriving businesses and industries. I know my grandfather was a fisherman. They had a boat. They worked the James River and the York River, harvesting oysters, fishing, and they also farmed too, although I understand the land back there is not good for farming, but they did farm. So the people were maintaining a life, and they were there for over 50 years until 1918. And in we know World War I started in 1914. So in 1914, initially the United States was going to be neutral and not get a role in the war. But this war, which later came to be called the Great War or the Big War, the United States was pulled into the war. And I'm still doing research on World War I, but at some point the government decided that, I don't know how they went from being neutral to deciding that we need to build a mine and we need to have mines to store explosives. So somehow I guess they did their research and decided that, well, this river is a wonderful location because, of course, we have Norfolk, which is not too far from Yorktown, but they decided on York County or Yorktown that would be an excellent place to build a naval mine depot, a place where they could store explosives. So through presidential proclamation, and that was Public Law 1492, which was passed in, I believe, August of 1918, where Woodrow Wilson, in his proclamation, established that they were going to confiscate the land and pay everybody $650, and that they had to move within 30 days.
Yeah, let me add. Of course, Woodrow Wilson was the 28th president. Now, it's interesting. You mentioned something earlier about you don't know how they went from almost kind of like being peaceful to all of a sudden, we got to get ready for this war. A little research on Woodrow Wilson. I'll just say this real quick. I found out he actually won the 1919 Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to secure world peace, which I thought was fascinating because, like you said, we don't know what generated that change. But I just thought that was interesting that he won a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to secure world peace, but then set up this.
Right. Well, he did not want war initially. I mean, his position was a position of neutrality, and he actually did work very hard in trying to keep the country out of war. In fact, in my research, Woodrow Wilson was the first American president who actually traveled to Europe. So he went to Europe to try to broker peace between the European leaders. So, and you also know he tried to establish the League of Nations, which he had a stroke later because they didn't want that. So apparently there were other elements pushing to get us in this war, because while we don't do a lot of research or study about World War I, but this was a war that started out, they were like fighting like face to face with guns, but it ended up with very modern type war. I mean, that's when airplanes were used and everything. So it turned into a much bigger war. But at some point, the United States was pulled into World War I.
Yeah, but here's what caught my attention, though, about Woodrow Wilson's actions. I mean, because when we think about these families that were relocated and probably, through eminent domain, but it doesn't sound like they got fair compensation. So I was just trying to figure out what, because at first I thought, well, it was Woodrow Wilson just some racist. I mean, it just, even though it was eminent domain, it just took the land. And when I found out about the Nobel Peace Prize, I was just wondering, did he intend to harm, and I'm kind of searching here, but did he intend to harm the families by just almost kicking them off the land? Or just what? Now, I don't know.
I,
Any thought on that?
well, I don't know if it was a personal issue. You know, I do know he did not want war. I'm sure there were other forces in the government or in the country moving him towards war. Even like not to talk about the current number 45, but who wants a war. So whether he wanted it or not, there were forces that were saying the United States is going to get in this war. So knowing that we were going to get in it and that they were going to need a place to store these mines because it was, I mean, this war was, you know, it was a big war and it was requiring a lot. And so I don't know if he took it personal that I'm destroying these families. I don't even know if he visited there, but it's just his proclamation, which was very brief, saying that, you know, they were going to secure that land. They secured over 18,000 square feet of land, which was really massive because they uprooted over 800, anywhere from 600 to 800 families were uprooted and moved. Out of that land that they took, they later built Fort Eustis, of course, the Yorktown Naval Weapons Station, which is one of the largest naval weapon stations in the United States. And so it was very disruptive. And the fact that he actually gave the people 30 days to move was even more disruptive because, as you can understand, this is like 50-some years after the Civil War. So you're dealing with people who, former enslaved people, people who probably could not read, very few probably could read, and while they had made a life and was living well, that this was still very disruptive at this point in time.
Well, without a doubt, I mean, when you say that there was about 50 years of being on the
Right.
reservation, and let me just, for our audience, the Naval Weapons Station in Yorktown, there's a definition here. It says, is a United States naval base in York County, James City County, and Newport News in the Hampton Roads region of Virginia. It provides a weapon and ammunition storage and loading facility for ships of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. Now, you mentioned that your uncle, Mr. Alexander Lee, was employed there at one point, right?
Yes.
And one of the questions I wanted to ask you, just out of curiosity, I wonder if his background had anything to do with him getting that job there. He was one of the only was he the only black person?
I don't know if he was the only black person because once the Naval Weapons Station, you know, got there, it did provide a source of employment in years later for African Americans and stable employment. And of course, if you were lucky enough to get a job at the Naval Weapons Station, you were a government employer. You had health insurance and benefits. So,
But do you have any idea when that employment may have started? Because this, matter of fact, as we all know, the 100th anniversary is coming up.
yes.
So I'm just curious, do you know at what time frame did they start hiring African Americans?
I'm not sure what time frame, but I just received in the email from a cousin 2 days ago, an interview from my uncle. And first time I had seen this interview, he did this interview in 1984.
And again, this is Mr. Alexander Lee.
Yes. And so he's been interviewed, he was interviewed several times by the Smithsonian and different groups. So he was often used to give reflections about early life in Williamsburg or York County. But from the interview he did in 1984, I think he was hired there in 1933. So,
1930.
right. So he was a young man. He was about 19 years old. So,
And the reason I was asking you that, Miss Lee, is because we were talking about Women Mary College, and I asked you, had you considered going there? And you mentioned you had graduated in 1966. And did I hear you correctly that African Americans were not attending Women Mary?
right.
And that was in the
In 1966, there had been no black person uh, attending Women Mary College on campus. I think prior to that, they had had Coach Hulon Willis, who was a coach at Virginia State College. He worked on his master's degree there. There was another young man from our hometown, Oscar Bladen, who was a son of the one black doctor that we had. Oscar had attended there, I think, in the 60s, but he could not live on campus, and he only went there 1 year. But prior to that, black students had not been admitted.
Okay. And that's why I was curious as to when African Americans, blacks, were first employed at Naval Weapons Station. And if he was employed, you mentioned 1930.
1933.
Yeah, now that's pretty interesting in a way. I mean, at that time frame that, he was working.
Right. Well, surprisingly, in the interview, he was saying he didn't know how he got the job. Someone must have pulled some strings for him or what. I don't know. He said, according to the interview, that he was blessed because he had been working at a job at Women Mary, I'm sure a low-level job, and something he was asked to do and he didn't want to do it. And so they told him he could leave. And I think he was getting $5 per month or $5 per week, some really small fee. And so he left. He left the job. And he said within 1 week, someone had called him and told him that they had a job for him at the Naval Weapons Station. And I'm sure he probably was one of the first blacks to be hired, there.
What about some of the historic designations that are present today at the Naval Weapons Station?
Okay, well, the Naval Weapons Stations is a highly secured facility. So you have to get permission to enter on the grounds of the Naval Weapons Station. I think my first visit to the Naval Weapons Stations was, we were having a family reunion in 1998. And my friend Gloria Fleming, who was assisting me with doing some family research since she worked for the Department of Navy, suggested that she would contact the Public Affairs Office and see if we couldn't get a visit to the Naval Weapons Station. So she, contacted the people, and that was part of our family reunion in 1998, where so at that time, there was nothing there to even reflect that there had been.
Okay, we're going to kind of, I just got a 1 minute cue, so we're going to come back to this. And I do want, this might be a good time for me to add, you mentioned your friend Gloria Fleming, who is our very esteemed producer of Africa's Vision Network. But we're going to come back, we're going to pick up on that point about, sounds like very limited historic designations at the site.
Yeah.
But we'll come back and we'll talk about
All
that
right,
after.
thank you, we will.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, Rosa, we're going to pick up on, we were talking about historic designations at the Naval Weapons Stations in Georgetown. For example, from what I read, there was a cemetery there. There were 3 churches.
Yes.
Share with our audience. Is there any of that left today?
No, nothing is there. And actually, when we had the family reunion and visited there in 1998, there were several older people who, they were like children when they, maybe 12, 8, when they left the reservation, but they were saying that things didn't look right, especially when we came to the part where the cemetery was, and they were saying, oh, I don't remember the cemetery actually being here. I remember when we walked to Williamsburg that the cemetery would be here or be there. So I think that when they were removed from the place, the houses that they had were knocked down, and so there was no real indication or semblance that they had even been there, that there had been a black community of people.
And that's interesting because you and I talked off camera. There's a red brick house of Mr. Henry Lee, an Englishman. So that's been preserved. So,
And that's probably from the section, because as I say, it's a very secured facility. So when you go there, I've only been allowed to go to that one area. But from my reading of the reservation, that after they removed the families from there, they configured the facility to meet their needs, you know, as a training ground and as a storage facility. I don't know why they maintain that particular, you know, house. But when I did go there, I didn't go inside the house, but I walked through the graveyard and looking at the names and things. I'm sure those families, because the Robert E. Lee's family, you know, his great grandfather and them, they had received land, you know, when they first came to the United States from the king. Because
Okay.
when the people were coming, they were given land, and even if they bought somebody else, they were given more land. So they had thousands and thousands of, you know,
let me
acres
ask
there.
you said at family reunions, you know, some of your research, some of the seniors, they say, oh, no, 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 like they didn't want to see it, they didn't want to hear about it. Do you think that was because there was pain to remember that experience, or just what? Or,
Yeah, now as I've gotten into the research and looking at the information and finding out things that happened, things that actually are documented to have happened, that somehow they must have picked it up or heard it or knew about it. Because even though those people who are 85 and 88 at the time when they came off the reservation, but I guess their contact with their parents, they must have ingested some feeling or some knowledge of what they had in the past and what was lost,
and maybe didn't want to
and
relive
didn't
it?
want to relive it. You know, when the families who signed the petition challenging their properties being taken and the price, they were saying like, you know, we have more than this, it's worth more than $650. So I actually made copies of actual testimonies of certain relatives who had gone before the board. And so I was just sharing some of the information out of it, and they didn't want to hear it. I know in the instance of my church, St. John Baptist Church, that was organized there in 1874, and the church was used as a school and a Sunday school and a regular everyday school. But when they had to leave and move to, you know, off the
the reservation.
grounds, and they moved on Penniman Road and built a new church, and just reading the testimony. So I was sharing that with one of the descendants of the Roberts family of when they went before the board. The question first was, how many trustees do your church have? So they say, well, we have 2. The response was, well, you need 5 trustees. So even that whole situation, you know, was very painful. I was sharing this, and she said, oh, I don't want to hear that, you know. So it's just those kinds of things, I think, that history, that unspoken history that so many families have, that they have knowledge of it, but the knowledge is just has not been talked about.
Yeah, the questions about trustees, that almost make me think of what took place down south about, you know, the voting and asking people these really crazy kind of questions. Now, with the cemetery, as a descendant, how do you feel knowing that there was a cemetery of your loved ones as a descendant, that they just pretty much discarded it like it was nothing, no matter how many people were buried there? I'm just curious, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, it's somewhat disheartening.
Okay.
And I know it's part of the racism that the African Americans have faced in this country from the day we came to this country. But knowing that it has happened in so many communities, some communities that have no idea that it even happened. But yeah, because I only knew Williamsburg growing up. So I got to know about York County after, after 1980. So while I feel disheartened, but in a way, I didn't know anything about that. But it's a bad feeling to think that people had no value or no worth of anything, and it's just that we can just toss it out like it never existed. But one good thing that with archaeology, that it does not lie.
Right.
And so artifacts and findings, will reveal certain things that, because in the person who led me to the petition and the fact that the burials were there, I mean, I know that in looking at some of the old death certificates, I always see like place of burial, Cheesecake Cemetery. I never thought anything about Cheesecake Cemetery because from the day that I was born, we always buried on Penniman Road at our church. But as I look into Cheesecake Cemetery and see how many families actually were buried there, and the young lady who is an archaeologist who used certain type of software that they were able to locate the burial grounds, and from the sightings on the software, see where there actually were grave, burials.
So with that being said, I know off camera you showed me a marker, a recent marker. I say recent because I think you mentioned it was 2012 or something like that.
2014,
2013?
right.
Okay, so that's very recent. And what was behind that? How did, if they put it in 2014, they were advised to move from the property in 1918. That sure took a long time to even acknowledge. So
Exactly.
what happened? How did that?
Well, and that also came about from, and I must give Dr. Shannon Sheila Mahoney, who's working on her dissertation at the College of Women Mary, who shared this information with me. But when she was doing her research, she discovered or found out a man by the name of Edward Ratcliffe, spelled Ratcliffe. And now the Ratcliffes who live in Williamsburg today, they spell their name R-A-D, not R-A-T, but it's the same family. And
I'm sorry, black family or white family?
black family.
Okay.
All right. And so Shannon found that Edward Ratcliffe actually was a United States colored soldier, served in the U.S. colored troops, and actually had received the Medal of Honor. It received one of the colored soldiers who got a Medal of Honor. And she was successful in getting a site there, noting that he was a soldier and was buried at Cheesecake Cemetery.
That's interesting. And for those who might be watching and maybe faced with something similar, you said she was able to get that marker. Any idea, did she go through the Department of Navy? Did she go through
Yeah,
local politicians?
she worked closely with the Naval Weapons Stations and their Public Affairs Department. So,
Okay. So as a descendant, how do you feel when you see that marker? And I'm sorry, can you share?
and I actually have not seen the marker other than in her book, because I actually, since 1998, have not been back to the Naval Weapons Station.
What does the marker say?
It says Cheesecake Cemetery, Medal of Honor, and then it lists his name and I think where he served.
Okay, so that really is just honoring
That one
person.
person.
All right. And by the way, it's called Cheesecake Cemetery, but there's a little history behind that, right? You want to share with our audience?
Well, to my knowledge, the history of that, as I say, the area and I don't see the map right now, but there was an area on the Yorktown Reservation called Indian Land where the Kissiyak Indians live. Now, there were several Indian groups in that area, but the Kissiyak were one group of Indians. And according to the black folklore is that the black people could not say Kissiyak, and so their word was cheesecake. So the Cheesecake Cemetery.
Fascinating.
Now, I do know that after the Civil War, my great uncles, two of them, William Moses Lee and Humphrey Lee, they took possession of the plantation that was located next to the cemetery, and kind of managed the burial grounds. They did not, and I think at the time that they were ordered off the reservation, there had been about 70 or 80 burials, in that 50-year period.
Wow. Now, Ms. Lee, that was, from what I read, a very serious explosion on the Naval Weapons
Yes.
Station. When I thought about the explosion, from what I understand, some of the people, they never did find any.
Didn't find anything.
Yeah, so it must have been a very serious explosion. But I was also wondering, could that have disturbed, and I'm really stretching here, but could that have disturbed even some of the remains?
Oh, no, no, it
Okay.
probably was not even in the same area.
Okay. So, for example, you mentioned your daughter is an archaeologist, I believe. I guess I was just curious if there might even be some more remains or some remains there of some of your descendants on the grounds there.
I'm sure because, as I say, there were three churches that when the families were displaced, there were three churches that came out of that area. Shiloh Baptist, was it Shiloh? Little Zion Baptist Church. Yes, Shiloh Baptist Church, which moved to Lackey and exists today. And actually, Shiloh had actually been in existence since 1864. They were organized November of 1864. St. John Baptist Church, but all those three churches had their own burial grounds.
Any idea how many members, the average number of members at those churches?
Well, from the testimony that when they appeared before the boards, because each of the boards were asking for, they wanted more money than what the government wanted to pay for their facility. So St. John said they had 500 to 600 members at that time. I don't know if they really did. I didn't bring pictures of the church, but they were saying they had 500 members.
Bottom line, it's a good probability that there still remains on that site.
Probably.
It makes me think of in Harlem, New York, I think. You
Right,
remember?
the African burial ground.
Right.
Yes.
And so I just wonder, we don't know who's watching the show, but I just wonder if there'll be somebody that might decide, well, we need to, even though it's very secure.
Right. Well, things are changed now. At some time, the government passed laws that if there were bodies there, that you just can't come in and, do like they did in 1918. There's a whole process, a procedure for removal of dead bodies. So I don't know what could be done about the bodies that were there or just what, because many of the people who did what they did back in 1918, some of them claim not to have any memory, they didn't
Right,
know. So,
Well, again, we never know who's watching Africa's Vision Network, and that might be someone who just like the young lady who did her research, might just decide, well, okay, this is interesting, because you don't just destroy, the sacredness of burial grounds, so to speak.
Right.
But let me go back to the petition. Because can you give me that date again? Did you say it was June 19 or November
Yes.
1918?
the petition, yes, was signed November 1918.
Okay. And help me out. So the petition in summary was to challenge, first of all, the price that they received for the land,
Their
et cetera.
removal, right.
Now, Ms. Lee, I find that very interesting because to think that back then there were a group of people who was willing to fight in the court. Any idea who may have taken the lead on that?
Yes, there were two, according to my research, there were two local lawyers. One, I think his last name was Geddy, Geddy, which was a white attorney, and I've forgotten the other one, but they did represent the families before the board of what was the Board of Valuation for commandeered property. I actually had the opportunity to make copies of some of the testimonies of the families who went before the board. But in their petition, they were saying to them that they were basically asking for additional time to stay there. They say November is the winter, and they had no money. They say most of our people are old, widows, and with children. So the petition was just asking them to afford them more time and to reevaluate the amounts that they were being offered.
And I'm sorry, what was the outcome? Was
Well,
the outcome, they were removed,
they
right?
were
Did they
removed,
get
but
extended time?
yes,
extension?
because as I say, my family was one of the first families to leave the reservation, and they left Yorktown and moved to Williamsburg in 1920.
Oh, okay.
And I know when I was looking at my grandfather's deed that he had purchased 20 acres in Williamsburg. And I know I had to ask my father one time, you know, where did he get? Because I think he put $250 down and then paid like $850. And I said, well, what kind of work did he do? Where did he get that kind of money? But, you know, I never got any real answers because,
Right.
as I say, they never really talked about, you know, that kind of thing. So,
So if I do the math, are we saying, though, they got roughly a 2-year extension from the time it was?
about that, yes. Because I think the last barrier, because even after most of the families moved, some of them did come back there and bury, but the last barrier took place there in about 1922. So after that, they were not allowed to come back there for burials. So by that time, the churches that had left, you know, had probably built churches elsewhere.
The 2-year extension, roughly, do you think that was the result of the petition, or had some petition? Had
You know,
some
some of the people left immediately, and one thing that's unclear to me that in the hearings from the Board of Valuations, that even though reportedly there were 600 to 800 families that had left, when I went through all 3 volumes of that, I only counted about maybe 60 or 70 families, different families. And so I know, like, some of the families didn't get anything. Some of the families actually left Virginia. Some went to Hampton. Some went to New Kent. They just went to various places. Hampton, Newport News, you know, and I guess they just started out with what little they got or whatever they had.
One of the things I was reading in my research, they were describing the reservation as a place for, I think they said, free people of color or something like that. But I decided to look up the definition, and they talked about these free people that there was some kind of partnership between the owners and the African American women. And I'm not sure if you follow me, but that kind of caught my attention because, you know, I didn't see any mention of men in terms of how they got some of this land.
Well,
I'm not sure.
actually, the lands were given to them by the Union soldiers, and of course, after, you know, the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, they were free. But in 1865, after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, everything changed, because Andrew Johnson, the president who became the president, he was a Southerner, and a Southerner who not only had run against Abraham Lincoln, but also disagreed with Lincoln.
Andrew Johnson, you were
Right.
sharing.
So immediately after Johnson took office, he started right back returning lands to former slave masters. And in fact, he was moving so speedily, and he didn't care very much for the blacks, and he let that be known. And so he started granting amnesty. In fact, in my research, I found that the family Thomas Tinsley, who were former owners of my family, that he was granted a presidential pardon or a forgiveness pardon is what it says.
I'm sorry, the pardon was for.
Pardon for, because the South, they were actually against the North. So
Right.
because they were what, rebels or
Okay.
traitors, they had to be accepted back into. So Andrew Johnson started right off. Let's forgive them. So for fighting against us, and Thomas Tinsley received he filed a petition to be forgiven, and got it like just a few months after the Civil War had ended. And because when I pulled the census record of 1870, Thomas Tinsley is in the same area, where my family are listed. And the 1870 census was the first census where black people were allowed to be named and, given it a first name and a last name. So Thomas Tinsley got his 2 properties back. And Andrew Johnson, well, in the Congress, there was a group of what they call radical Republicans. And it's like, hey, we got to stop this. You have all these thousands and thousands of blacks who are uneducated, poor, they have no way of making it. What are you going to do for them? Because they had to force his hand to make him, do anything, because they did get the Freedoms Bureau set up, to provide rations, food, or what have you, and help. But a lot of the things that had been given to those black communities right after, the war, Andrew Johnson was taking them away. And of course, he was impeached for that. The impeach didn't go through, but he was impeached. And I think it was lost by maybe 1 or 2 votes.
Okay.
But, so yeah.
Well, that's fascinating history because, again, I was born in Virginia. My family probably were not too far from your family. I mentioned it was called Charles City.
Charles City. Yeah.
And so to hear some of that history is just amazing. So, and we got several more minutes, but where do you go from here with your research? And for the people who are listening, viewing the show, and may want to do research on their family, where do you go and why is this important to even do it?
Right. Well, I think it's important to do, basically for African Americans, so much of our history is unknown. Because of the bitter part of our history, coming to America and being enslaved, a lot of families didn't talk about it, did not want to talk about it. But on the other hand, our survival has been so rich that we should talk about it and we should value it and understand that all the stories are true and the information is out there, and you should know it and honor your ancestors' efforts to survive and live in the system that they were dealt.
And that's interesting because let me ask you this, especially what I might use the term called the New America. I mean, you have Indians, you have more Hispanics, you have just a diverse group of people. In your opinion, why is it important for them to also know about this history?
I think it's important for everybody to know their own history because all people are valuable. So your history is valuable, no matter from where you came, it's valuable. I mean, it's what made up the world and what made up this country.
Right, but for example, let's say, Hispanics or Indians learning to appreciate the African American history and vice versa. Mm-hmm. But I was just curious from your perspective, why, if a young student came in and said, well, look, I'm not African American, so why should I have an interest in African American history?
Well, and that question has been asked. I was at a presentation not too long ago, and one of the students said they didn't think it made any sense to celebrate African American history because we were trying to separate ourselves. Mm. Well, I don't think it's about separating yourself. It's about knowing and understanding. So, I encourage anybody to study yourself, study your history so that you can know yourself better. And it's very important. And I kind of disagree that our children don't want to know. I think because it's just not talked about, they probably think there's no value or no worth to it. But if they would study it, they would understand the value and the worth because it's about themselves. And so it's about valuing yourself.
And let me go back if I can. You said you got that question. I'm just curious. Was that question from an African American student or?
No, it wasn't.
Okay. Well, I'm just curious. Were you surprised or were you caught off guard by that question?
Well, it wasn't directed to me. I was at a
okay.
presentation.
But to hear it then.
And not really. I wasn't surprised. I mean, I've heard that before.
Okay. Well, Miss Lee, I just got a cue. We got about 3 minutes. And
Okay.
wow. What else do you want to share with our viewers and what this has meant to you in terms of doing the research? I know you mentioned our esteemed producer, Miss Gloria Fleming, pushed you. And look, I know Gloria, she can do
can
some
push.
pushing. She's good at that. But it was very important, a very important push. So what else do you want to share with in a few minutes?
Yeah,
couple
well, I
minutes?
just want to share that all families should know their history, and you should start doing your research now. Find the oldest person in your family, talk with them, and engage yourself on that spiritual journey of getting to know your family and their story.
And if I can, I'm trying to sneak this point in. I remember, excuse me, with my mother and grandmother and aunts, excuse me, they used to always say, have conversations with people too, because you never know the link that you may have. There might be a DNA link there. And so, do you plan to write a book?
Yes,
Okay.
I do plan on getting my book published, my presentation.
Okay.
Yes.
Going to use the same title, Quiet Determination?
Yes,
or-
I'll use it.
Right. And if I can sneak this in real quick, with your daughter, by chance when you talk to her, has it ever popped in her mind that, Mom, maybe we should go there and get a dig at the naval?
Well, she did her research in Texas and she is a diaspora archaeologist, and so she's very much interested in that.
Right.
Yes.
Well, Miss Rosalie, it has been a pleasure sitting down hearing this very valuable information. Again, we're both from Virginia, and I just want to thank you very much, and we wish you the best success in the future with your book and other places you may be sharing this very, very valuable information. So I want to say, God bless you, and
thank
thank
you.
you very much for sharing all this information.
Thank you.
And we know that our audience have been really informed.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah. So thank you very much.
you.